I want to share with you the words of Frederick Douglass from 1850, who wrote, "The fact that the church of our country, with fractional exceptions, does not esteem the fugitive slave law as a declaration of war against religious liberty, this implies that the church regards religion simply as a form of worship, an empty ceremony, and not a vital principle requiring active benevolence, justice, love, and goodwill towards man. It esteems sacrifice above mercy, psalm singing above right doing, solemn meetings above practical righteousness, a worship that can be conducted by persons who refuse to give shelter to the houseless, to give bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, and who enjoin obedience to a law forbidding these acts of mercy is a curse, not a blessing to mankind. The Bible addresses all such persons as scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, who pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith." I share these words with you today in worship, the words of Frederick Douglass, because they are crisp in their frustration. You cannot misinterpret what he is trying to say. No massive outcry about the way that newly passed federal law, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, that newly passed law compelled those religiously opposed to enslavement to participate in it, meant that a lot of people who professed to be religious were in fact really more married to the trappings of faith than to living it. Religion is not just something you believe, it's something you do, says Douglass. In 1850, even in our fair city of Philadelphia, there were strains of dissent and rifts that formed within Unitarian and Universalist circles at the time. It was not a given that each and every Unitarian and Universalist was a staunch abolitionist. There were many who were unsure, who felt that it might be moving a bit too fast to simply do away with the institution without a process in place that slowly dismantled it. And there were those who were just actually in favor of maintaining it. The president himself, who signed the Fugitive Slave Law, was a Unitarian, writing to Daniel Webster, "God knows I detest slavery, but we must endure it and give it such protection as it is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world." To detest it, but thinking that you must endure it, knowing that it's guaranteed by the Constitution, but wrong according to your faith. For those who saw chattel slavery for what it was, Reverend Theodore Parker called it our great national sin in the year 1841. For those who saw it for what it was, it took a moral imagination to envision a world in which our economic engine, our social fabric, was not entirely dependent on the treatment of humans as animals to be bought and sold and killed for the sole purpose of money making. When I say it like that, it feels a bit heavy-handed, but truly it required a kind of creativity and a commitment to that creative vision to see beyond the present moment. It took wondering, what would it look like? What could it look like? What might it feel like? There was no blueprint. Slavery and the United States had existed side by side for over 200 years by 1850. I see the same things at stake in today's Unitarian Universalist congregations and in our debates, but not about the abolition of slavery, but its mutated, warped kin, the prison industrial complex. The same way we could divide ourselves into camps, those who desire the immediate cessation, those who advocate a slow and planful breaking down, and those who are committed in word but not in deed. And the same things are required today: a moral imagination, a willingness to ask ourselves questions like, what would it look like if people did bad things and we treated them humanely for being imperfect, just as we all are? What would it look like to have mental health services instead of prison cells? What would it look like for every correctional officer to be retrained in restorative justice instead of punitive justice? What is justice? What would it feel like in our culture and in our bodies to know that there were not, as there are this very moment, millions of people warehoused away from natural light and fresh air, hours from their families, cut off from the world with terrible food, limited stimulation, and threats of physical violence ever present? What would it feel like to us to know that everyone was tended to and cared for and had what they need? What might it do to us? These are the kinds of questions we have to be willing to sit with, to imagine, to get creative and then committed, because whatever your vision might be in response to these questions, your faith demands that you consider it real. Not a fake or impractical or foolish endeavor, but rather a necessary and vitally important exercise. Just as in 1850, there is no blueprint, there is no roadmap, only an abiding conviction in our guts of the wrongness of the institution, such an overwhelming wrongness that we cannot wait. We cannot prioritize pragmatism. We must work to make our faith a blessing to this world, as Douglas would have it, not a continuation of a curse, one that deems some people's lives as disposable and some people as worthless. Mumia Abu-Jamal is a political prisoner right here in Philadelphia. He's written and published extensively since being incarcerated, and his words on the role of religion, the need for a reform of religion, bear the echoes of Frederick Douglass some 170 years ago. He writes, "We are in need of a religion of life that sees the world in more than merely utilitarian terms, a religion that reveres all life as valuable in itself. We need a religion that recognizes the interdependence of humanity in this world." If that's not what we strive for in this faith, I think I may have gotten seminary all wrong. We are of the faith that Mumia describes us all as needing. So may this service be a charge for you to internalize and make real the need for Unitarian Universalists to rise up as one and demand, faithfully and forcefully, the cessation of prisons, the cessation of jails, the end and the abolition of incarceration. Blessed be, and amen.
When I imagine a prison, I think about SCI Chester. It's where I took an Inside Out class in fall 2016. Inside Out classes are college-level classes with both incarcerated and non-incarcerated students. Ours was held in the visiting room at that prison. I can visualize the waiting room there, the rows of black plastic seats facing the large security desk in the front of the room, the lockers for items not allowed inside, the metal detector in the corner. In my memory, the security procedure for outside students, those of us who are not incarcerated, was always slightly different week to week, but had to be followed to a T. Getting books in could be difficult. Spiral-bound notebooks and pens or mechanical pencils just weren't an option. We outside students all wore a program t-shirt, but our inside classmates weren't allowed to because prison officials said they would forget to be inmates. Some days we inexplicably had to start class half an hour late, but we were always cut short at the usual end time. One day, after a long wait, we found we couldn't hold class at all. All of these small details that hint at the larger realities of prison, the restriction, the control, the dehumanization. These moments might happen every day across the country, but that doesn't mean they're normal. As my incarcerated pen pal Felix Rosado wrote in an article just over a year ago, speaking about the pandemic and the desire to return to normal, he said, "What's normal about the caging of humans? We find ways to transcend, to make meaning, to breach fences and razor wire, but it's never enough. It never goes all the way." And speaking of meaning making, after going through security and getting to class, that's when we started our discussion each week. We reflected on readings and brainstormed in pairs. We made jokes, we challenged each other. We were there to ground each other the day after that fateful presidential election that year. Our short time together in that class was a reminder to all of us that prison walls or not, we are interconnected. And each of us is a human being whose life is much, much more than the worst things we've ever done. Humans in an unhuman system. I describe myself as a prison abolitionist, someone who believes that we as a society need to make a fundamental shift, to transition away from prisons, to create safety by providing everyone with the resources we need, and to take a more constructive, healing approach to address situations where people harm those around them. It's something that might seem unthinkable, but as Reverend Hannah said, it's possible and it's necessary to live in a world where we see our values as you use embodied. And part of why I believe this is because the criminal justice system, or as I'm going to call it today, the criminal punishment system, is fundamentally tied up in systemic racism and so many other forms of oppression that are unjust, that take away humanity. Knowing some history might help to understand where I'm coming from. I'm going to quote an interview by abolitionist Miriam Kaba. She says, "Prison itself is a reform." I think that's something that most people don't think about. Prisons haven't always existed. They came into being, especially in the United States, because people were reacting against capital punishment and corporal punishment, which were seen at the time, particularly by Quakers, as incredibly inhumane. Initially, the reform was not meant to be a brutalizing thing, but isolation itself is actually brutal. She continues, early before the Civil War, most people who were locked up were not actually Black people because almost every Black person in the country was enslaved. Immediately after emancipation, all of a sudden, the literal complexion of prisons changed, and Black people became hyper targets of that system as we created new laws like the Black Codes. The convict lease system comes into being as a way to continue to exploit the labor of people who are now newly free. And the reason to talk about that history is to demystify how and why people ended up behind bars initially. It wasn't really about crime. It was about a perception that Black people were inherently criminal, that Black people couldn't manage freedom. So we can see here that there's a long history of using the criminal punishment system and narratives about criminality as tools of anti-Black racism. It wasn't really about crime. It was about a perception that Black people were inherently criminal. Flash forward to a little over 50 years ago, as Jim Crow segregation was being dismantled, the criminalization of Black protest and unequally enforced drug laws became a way to replace that dying system. Over and over, politicians kept ramping up punitive sentencing laws. Jobs were vanishing from cities, and people were increasingly pushed into street economies. Meanwhile, neighborhoods where Black, brown, and poor people live have been grossly starved of resources for things like schools, libraries, community centers, housing, small businesses. But money kept flowing for prisons and police. And the end result is mass incarceration, astonishing numbers of people, and particularly Black, brown, and poor people, incarcerated in prisons and jails across the country. Women defending themselves against sexual violence, trans and queer people singled out for their gender expression, homeless people whose means of survival is criminalized, people with mental illnesses who are locked up instead of cared for. Many, many systems of oppression feed people into prisons. Racism is fundamentally dehumanizing. At what point will we say prisons are fundamentally dehumanizing? And as Unitarian Universalists, we are people who covenant to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of each person. We have to push ourselves to truly mean each and every person. including incarcerated people and people targeted by the criminal punishment system. Just as many of us say all lives can't matter until Black lives matter, let's work with urgency and self-awareness towards a society that doesn't use incarceration to trample on people's human dignity every day. In this congregation, we remind ourselves in our baby dedications of this historical UU belief that people are born of original blessing, not original sin. Each one of us deserves so much more than the systems we are born into. And that is particularly true for people whose society is more willing to lock away than to heal or provide the resources that they need to thrive. And still, those of us who are not directly harmed by the criminal punishment system, we still live with the consequences of existing in a society with racism at its core and punishment as its mode of operation. We all deserve a profoundly different world. Reverend Jason Leiden, a formerly incarcerated UU minister, says the legacy we should take from our Universalist history, that tradition that said, if God is so loving, then hell cannot exist, is that it is our calling today to eliminate human-created hells on earth. So what I want to leave you with today is that I see the practice of organizing for abolition as part of how I live out my faith as a UU, showing up for and working alongside transformative movements led by people who are directly impacted by the criminal punishment system, things like the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. Organizing our congregation with others in the First U decarceration team, which serves as a channel for all of us at First U to engage with such movements. And I'll add, some of us in those movements see them as a step on the way to abolition, and others as a way to scale back after these 50 years of mass incarceration. So wherever you fall in that, for anyone interested, Kate is going to put in the chat a form to sign up to get involved with the First U decarceration team. And ultimately, as Reverend Hannah spoke about, I live out my UU faith by pushing my moral imagination beyond what seems possible. Pushing to imagine that world where prisons are made obsolete by resources that help prevent violence and alternative ways of responding to harm.
Activist and scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said that abolition is about presence, not absence. I am a prison abolitionist, though until recently, my abolitionist stance was based primarily on absence rather than presence, a world without prisons. I have spent the last decade going into jails and prisons as a volunteer in educational and community building programs. I have met and formed relationships with many people incarcerated within these institutions. Some of the most inspiring people in my life are people I have met in prison, the way they have made dignified and meaningful lives in places designed to undermine dignity and meaning at every turn. Through these experiences, I had developed a litany of reasons why we should do away with prisons. Because caging human beings is inhumane and serves none of us. Because prisons are filled with people who have experienced and witnessed many harms themselves, even though they may have harmed another. Because punishment of all kinds is harm in response to harm that continues a cycle of harm. Because prisons serve oppressive means and ends, policing and maintaining the boundaries of our various social hierarchies. Because prisons don't fix anyone. Because they don't heal anyone. Because as they are, prisons don't keep any of us safe. Yet I know that for some people, even in hearing this list, the abolition or absence of prisons is hard to imagine. I teach at a small college here in Philadelphia, and my students, for example, feel very challenged by this concept. For some of them, it feels frightening. For others, it feels unrealistic and naive. For still others, it flies in the face of their undisturbed truth that we need prisons in order to punish people and teach them a lesson. There need to be consequences, they say, for people's bad behavior. Yet I have come to realize that focusing on absence, on getting rid of prisons, sometimes even somehow getting rid of them suddenly, produces a kind of stuckness on the idea of it, and then a stunted imagination. But what if we were to delve into this idea of presence instead, of building instead of destroying, of imagining and creating instead of only abolishing? What would need to be present among us in order for prisons to be absent? This is Ariana Salgado's suggestion shared during the welcome of our service this morning. Abolition means a world where the basic necessities of folks, such as healthcare, housing, food, and education, are met. A world where we work as a community to keep each other safe and develop alternatives to caging folks in response to any conflict. Brick by brick, wall by wall, we must build all of these things and more. But I would first like to focus on the last part of what Salgado states, that we must develop alternatives to caging folks in response to any conflict. Here, I believe she is talking about justice, or at least one common understanding of justice in our society. When serious incidents of harm or individual wrongdoing capture popular attention, there are often demands for justice that seem to translate into demands for punishment through what is commonly referred to as our criminal justice system. As Unitarian Universalists, we say that we value justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. But I wonder how many of us have really sat with this term justice and articulated what we mean by it. Do we mean punishment when we say justice? I am inclined to think that we do not. Historically, the word justice comes to us from the Latin justus, meaning right or righteous. In its active form, it would mean to make right or put into right relationship. This seems closer to what I think we mean, to make right or put into right relationship. I would suggest that our conventional criminal justice system is our society's attempt to make right. A crime or a wrong happens, and our criminal justice system is supposed to right that wrong, at least in theory. Yet for a variety of reasons, many of which Sonja already addressed, it is a deeply, deeply flawed system. It is a system based on retribution and oppression. It is, in all actuality, a system based on absence. The absence of community, the absence of care, the absence of healing and human dignity, and the absence of actually making right. But alternatives to caging folks in response to any conflict, as Salgado urges us to create, already exist. They exist in the movements and practices of restorative and transformative justice. We need more of their careful presence. Some of you may have heard of restorative justice. Not a single program, but a variety of community-based programs and practices that redefine crime as harm and then bring together those impacted in order to address the needs that arise from that harm and decide together what accountability looks like. It is both old and new. Historically, Indigenous people around the world engaged in circle processes and communal approaches to healing harm. For roughly 40 years now, people in Western colonizing countries have borrowed from these rich traditions in order to respond to harm in their own societies, calling it restorative justice, a different way of making right than the systems of punishment we've otherwise put in place. So we have been building, creating, presencing, if you will, alternatives to caging people in response to any conflict. A common iteration of restorative justice is a circle gathering that brings together the person who caused a particular harm, someone who loves and supports that person, the person who is harmed in the situation, someone who loves and supports that person. And since we are all interconnected, members of the community who are impacted are also present. A facilitator guides the process as each person asks or answers a question or otherwise shares what they need to share. Together, the group decides how to move forward in a way that helps to make things as right as they can possibly be. Imagine for a moment sharing your story of pain and being heard and validated. Imagine someone taking genuine accountability for the pain they caused you. Or imagine being supported and loved as a full human being as you offer an authentic apology to someone you have harmed. Like prison abolition, my students have a hard time believing that this kind of process is possible, or they think that it is only appropriate for minor infractions. Soon, though, they learn that it is not only possible, but that it exists. It is present already. It is happening all over the country. And perhaps hardest of all to imagine is that it is happening in instances of severe harm, in cases of homicide, aggravated assault, sexual violence, theft, arson. Restorative justice is now also used in proactive community building ways before harm happens. People circling up to intentionally create places of inclusivity, compassion, and belonging in schools, neighborhoods, religious communities. Imagine a world with more and more of this kind of connecting, this kind of support. However, like most human enterprises in our still as yet fractured world, restorative justice is not without its limitations, not without the potential to reproduce the structures of harm and inequity that constitute our current world. If we only focus on instances of individual harm, for example, it will be like dumping water out of a boat that has a huge hole in it. We must at the same time address the various systems of oppression that cause so much harm among us, within which we harm one another. This is what people often refer to as transformative justice. It is a movement of larger presencing, of building systems of support and connection that allow us all to thrive in our interconnectedness. After stating that prison abolition is about presence, not absence, Ruth Wilson Gilmore adds, it's about building life-affirming institutions. This is Salgado's call for a world where basic necessities of folks such as healthcare, housing, food, and education are met. In fact, as Unitarian Universalists, we have good grounding for this, as we covenant to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, a world in right relationship. To imagine a world without prisons, we must imagine a world of abundance. Prisons will not go away today, but today we can imagine the world we need to create in order to do without them, and we can join in the work that is already underway. May it be so.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abby Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abby just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.